I'm aware there's some criticisms from people in Africa who are discussing that the Bitcoin approach to Africa seems to be a little bit poverty porn, and there's actually good things happening in Africa as well as difficult things. So I'm conscious of that. But Erik, I'm going to ask you just to kind of like set the scene for Bitcoin in Africa.
God, not a small.
Yeah.
Geez. So yeah, I think broadly speaking, Bitcoin in Africa there's a deep need for it, right? I think that's the biggest response to it. How that need is answered, it varies. So right now we're seeing that there's a lot of people who are buying it, and what you don't know is who they are, right? Nor should you. But it seems to be it's a lot of middle upper class and upper class people who are buying it as a way to hedge against their local currencies. I think what most of the Bitcoin community in Africa is looking at, though, is how is this Bitcoin used by ordinary people in everyday life? And there's a bunch of things to unpack in that, one of which is on-ramps and off-ramps, which are a big problem right now. The use of is something that's a little bit easier to get your head around. And there's some really great opportunities in that space and people executing on it, like Machankura. But you know, I can talk a little bit more about this, but the Kenyan Bitcoin community got together and did a bunch of research on every on and off ramp to buy Bitcoin. And I'm putting all that research together right now. It was against, I think, 8 or 9 different levels of, you know, everything from UX to, you know, how long it takes to liquidity, all these different things, how technical you have to be to use it. And it's a major barrier. So a lot of interesting things happening. I think more will be happening, but it's also very nascent. It's early days.
And what are the primary needs for Bitcoin in Africa? You talked about people hedging risk with currency. Is it generally the same use cases that I would have, or are there actually different ones that I wouldn't be aware of?
They'd be similar to what other Bitcoiners are facing around the world, which is like, how do you bypass the banks that, you know, make transactions too slow for businesses? Or you have to do, you know, if I even am receiving into my bank in Kenya $1,000, I have to send them a letter signed with ink to state why it's coming in and who it's coming from.
Even at $1,000? Even
at $1,000.
Every $1,000?
Every time, right? Otherwise, it'll come in and they might refuse it. Most of the time, they will refuse it. And so there's like, and that's not even withdrawing it, that's receiving it.
Okay,
right?
So that's actually worse than what we face here.
So it varies. So it depends on your bank, depends on your country. We're talking about a continent with 54 countries, and it varies significantly between all of these countries as well. And so you're dealing with that kind of level, which is a business trying to use it. Then you're also dealing with ordinary people. How do you transact to send money if you come from Uganda but you live in Kenya? It's actually quite difficult. You have to use some type of MoneyGram option for that, and that's fairly expensive. Then there's banks, borders. Those are the two kind of biggest use cases. And I think the real long-term story is, what's your hedge against your local currency, where you have massive devaluation happening, or you could have, depending on the way the government has acted in the past 2, 5, or 10 years. And we're starting to see that. You see, like just last year, Ghana had a major devaluation in its currency. You have that happening in Kenya. We've lost 20% value in our currency over the last year. And those kind of things happening do have an effect on you. Now, most people, and I'm talking about like in every country, most of the people in Africa do not have enough for savings. So what they'll be doing is they're putting their money into something. Traditionally, that's been put into land. Or something like that will hold its value, or perceived hold its value, right? In Kenya, that's why land prices are so high. But what else is there to put it into? What happens if land isn't the only option anymore? And anyway, there's a whole area there that's really interesting to unpack and see what real people do in their real lives when savings either A, isn't an option, or the options for the savings, being a traditional bank, are not good.
Okay, and can you just talk to me a little bit more general about the economic situation in the various countries you're aware of in Africa? And what specifically want to know is like, what is the good stuff? What is the bad stuff? We tend to hear the bad stuff more, news and media does tend to report on corruption or political strife or famines, civil wars, etc. But I'm also fully aware there are parts of Africa that are thriving. The economy is thriving in certain parts of Africa. What are we not seeing?
Yeah, I think what we're used to in the West is the media narrative that we've had for, I don't know, 30, 40 years.
Since Ethiopia, basically.
Right. Well, it's either, yeah, you're right. But there's a famous saying, which is the Africa that's of the 80s and 90s is not the Africa of today.
Okay.
And yet we have that Africa in our head. And so there's other good things that are also in the media narrative, which is like Kenyan or Ethiopian runners, right?
Yeah.
Or safaris and all the tourism that comes with that, the wildlife. And those are also generalities and can be cliche also, just as all the negative things, all the negative stereotypes can be also as well. So, what's going on that's good there? Well, you do have a massive amount of people who are just really entrepreneurs, mostly born of necessity because they have to. There's not as many like ordinary big company or medium-sized company jobs. So they're out there as entrepreneurs hustling, making things happen. People work hard. They are smart. There's guys who are just like really working their butts off to try and make their way in the world and making it to great universities all over the globe. And then they're coming back and they're building businesses or they get in government, which sometimes goes sideways. So you have this population base that's young. Like Africa, it does have I think the youngest demographic in the world as far as continents go, with I think the average age being around 16 or 18, somewhere in that range. And so it's a young continent that has a lot of growth, a lot of raw materials and resources. And it's about the government and the people then figuring out how can we align what we actually have that's really strong about us and do something with it instead of being used by other countries around the world, which is what's happened for the last 50 or 100 years.
Well, it goes back to that Gladstein economic imperialism stuff. I don't know if you've read his latest book or listened to the show.
Where he's talking about like the IMF giving loans to the shrimpers and all that kind of stuff. Crazy.
Yeah. And in terms of major cities, how well developed is the infrastructure? Like if I go to a major city in Africa, is it great Wi-Fi, great transport? Is it pretty much like any major city?
Yeah, if you go to your, Cape Towns and Joburgs, they're probably the furthest along. Nigeria has Lagos, and Kenya has Nairobi. You've got Cairo. Those are big cities that are big global cities, and they're going to have everything you would expect. Sometimes more traffic than you would expect too. Though I mean, it's like it can be standstill traffic sometimes, but you can get pretty much anything you would find in the West or even in Asia. You can find there. It's going to have its own way about it. Africa is Africa, the same way Europe is Europe, and so it has its own
intricacies. Yeah. But you get that here.
Yeah, you totally get it. But it's got its own flavor. People are very open and friendly across most of the continent. It's hard to speak in generalities about the whole continent, but across most of the continent, people are very open and generous and friendly. And I think that generosity actually surprises a lot of Westerners when they come in.
Surprised me. When I got there, I was thinking, this is going to be similar to Puerto Rico. Everybody thinks you're a colonizer, imperialist. It was awesome. Everybody's just like, oh, you're another dude. What's up? It was really cool.
Which parts did you go to?
So I've only been once to see these guys, and I went just to Kenya.
And which parts? You went to Nairobi and
We
now
went to
into the
Nairobi.
village?
We went to...
We went up country to the mines, and then we went off to safari for a couple of days.
And okay, so talk me through your experience just arriving.
Mm-hmm.
I was like quick judged by the airports. I think you get a lot from the airport. Like
But
when I went to Venice,
taxi driver.
did you?
yeah. He pulls up in a 1970s Land Rover.
Love it.
Not Land Rover. I don't do Land Rovers. I do Land Cruisers. So it's important. This is like
That's their hotly contested thing.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So I was expecting the Africa of the 90s.
Okay.
100%. And I felt after my trip, I told people I was lied to about Africa. It's like we were talking about earlier. It's a land where everything grows. In my limited experience, right? The people were super hospitable. The food was great. Internet was fast. It was, at least in Nairobi, it was very not what I was expecting. I was expecting, to get off the plane and people immediately tell you to go back home. And it was not like that at all. It was very welcoming and very different than what I thought.
Felt safe?
Oh, yeah.
And in terms of the Bitcoin world, the external Bitcoin world outside of Africa, I'm really conscious to not be exploitative of Africa and talk about it as this great opportunity, where in the back of my mind, I'm just trying to grow Bitcoin and not really having the right empathy for what the needs and the pressing needs are there. But if you were to speak to the kind of general Bitcoin community, what would you be saying we should be doing to support Africa? And I don't say that like as some kind of charity. We should be supporting South America, which we've done. We've been out to South America. What is it, the specific needs that?
So I think it's just like any other thing. Like I've been in the tech industry in Africa for decades now. And it's just like, you have entrepreneurs who are trying to build things in the Bitcoin space. Where they get their investment from doesn't matter. It's capital that gets put to work for something that grows the pie, right? And so I think that's one area is like, look for the entrepreneurs who are actual builders and support them. Right. There's some really good education efforts going on, community growth efforts that I'm not involved in because I'm a builder. I'm not a community person in that way. And I think those are fantastic, though. I hope they get more support, too. Every from, the Ikasi guys down in South Africa to Bitcoin Dada, which is the women's training in Kenya. There's some really cool stuff that's happening. Like, how do they get support, too? I think some of that support has to be local, right? I don't think it should all come from outside either. I think local investors and local people who just like this thing are need to get behind it and help it become a bigger thing. That's where you get the organic growth, and that's really what you want. You don't want a manufactured growth around it. But yeah, I think, be involved, include them, sure, I can be here in Miami at the Bitcoin conference because, as our company, we can just pay for me to buy a plane ticket and go. It's harder for some of these other guys who are building great stuff. They might not have all the same resources, and they definitely have a harder time getting the visa. Right. And that's a major hurdle to overcome. But getting the, and I've seen this where you have guys like KG from Machinkura, you have, I think Marcel from Bitcoin Dada, different people who are going to other places now. And I think one of the best things that you can have is a mixing of the blood where you get to meet people like yourself from other parts of the world and they get to meet you, and it helps you understand each other, and you actually realize you're not that different from each other, even though you're doing it in a place that I've never been and you're doing another place that I never will go to. And once you have that shared mind about what's going on and you understand each other, you actually get the empathy automatically. And when that happens, good things happen to everybody, right? It's like, we had this saying with, in our tech space in Arabic, which you put enough, good, smart people together in a room and good things happen. You don't have to manufacture it. It just happens. So how do you get these people from these communities who are trying to push or build in Bitcoin in Africa with those from the rest of the world? I think Africa Bitcoin Conference is a good first step in that direction. But I also think it's important to get the Africans out of Africa just as much as it is to get non-Africans to Africa. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're gonna go.
Yep.
Yeah. We're gonna head out there. We'll come and see you. I think we're going to try and do Kenya, Nigeria, and I think it's Malawi. People are recommending we go to.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd go under your recommendation.
You should also take a look at. So I think the big three are always South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya. Right.
Yeah.
Now, those are the big economies of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
And they have a lot of stuff going on in Bitcoin, just like you would expect. But if you get off the beaten track into Malawi,
yes, please,
you get to like even a more raw version, which is like, it feels like, when I was growing up, that's the Africa I grew up in. Right. And it's very different than it is when you're in the big economies.
Have you lived your whole life there?
Yeah. I grew up in Sudan and Kenya. When I was 6 years old, we moved from Sudan because the war got so bad. Yeah.
Yeah. So, my boy will tell you this. I like going to the weirdest, strangest, like my favorite two places I've been to are Venezuela and India, just because it's so wild and different.
Yeah.
And so when you say Sudan, I'm like, can we go?
South Sudan is the Wild West.
Yeah. Can we go?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And we have the contacts in South Sudan to make it as safe as you can be in South Sudan.
Yeah. Is there government in South Sudan?
Yeah. Well, it depends where in South Sudan you go,
Yeah.
like who's in charge.
I've got no context for this. What's happening in South Sudan?
So South Sudan got independence from Sudan about just over a decade ago. And as they did, they have, just like any new country, had their internal fights over who's in charge, how the resources are spent. And so there's currently, it always feels like there's currently some type of stress on the system because of that.
Right.
It's not as bad as Sudan proper right now, though. Sudan proper is in a mess.
Is that in like civil war or?
Yeah, it's being contested now between generals.
Okay.
We can't go there.
I wouldn't go there.
All right, we won't go there. Okay.
If I wouldn't go there,
If the
you probably
guy
shouldn't
that's
go there.
from there wouldn't go there, probably shouldn't go
I'm
there.
pretty okay with like travel in Africa into risky situations, and I'm not going to Khartoum right now.
Okay. Definitely?
Definitely.
Okay. Right. We'll see if we can change your mind. Okay. So, one of the things I found also with traveling with this is that the hardest place to explain Bitcoin to is like my friends in Bedford. They just don't get it, and because they don't have a need for it, really. They don't realize they have a need for it. I think they have a need for it. They don't realize it. They're like, if I went through my 8 best friends, I think one of them might have a bit of Bitcoins, definitely got some shitcoins, but they don't really have it. And so I've just given up. I don't even talk to them about Bitcoin when I'm home. It's not a conversation that comes up anymore because I bore them. When I went to Argentina or when I was in El Salvador or Venezuela, and you talk to people and you talk about what Bitcoin is, they get it. Like the more fuck their currency is, the more they get it. Is that a similar thing in Africa? People understand it a bit more?
The concept of what Bitcoin can do for you is something that is appreciated. What's interesting about what you just said is that Kenya is probably the least likely to adopt Bitcoin as day-to-day use because we have M-Pesa. M-Pesa was one of the first mobile money systems in the world, and it's massive. I think it moves about 20% of the GDP daily. It's incredibly big, and so everybody has something in their pocket that they can just send money around quite easily. Now it's expensive. There's a fairly large size tax on it, and so the transaction costs are expensive.
Is it a percentage or fixed or mixed?
It depends on how much you're moving.
Yeah, it's like a tiered fee structure.
Yeah.
Okay, say I'm sending you equivalent of £10. What do you think I would be paying?
About 1,500 shillings. So that you would probably spend about 20 shillings on that, to move it.
What's
Maybe
it?
30.
What's that as a percent? Do you think?
It's about 1%.
Yeah, 1 to 3%.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, but why that's important? People, again, I come across this in Bitcoin circles all the time. They're like, why don't you just use Lightning? Why don't you just do this? You think that's a small transaction fee, right? Because of its relative size to you and your money. When you're talking about an ordinary Kenyan moving that much money, they'd actually rather do it in cash. That 1 to 3%, those 20, 30 shillings actually mean something.
Right.
And so for you and I, we're like, yeah, whatever. Just we kind of forget about that value because it doesn't, the speed by which we can do the transaction is more important, the ease of use. But for ordinary people, they would much rather use cash. So when they use M-Pesa, it's for a reason. It's because somebody's across town or they're sending money to their grandmother up country, or they're doing a business transaction that they just have to do it this way anyway. And yeah, it's useful, but it's also constraining. However, the main point is in Kenya, we actually really understand it. So when you show somebody Bitcoin and how you can move money on the Lightning, everybody's like automatically gets it. No problem. You go to some other countries and they don't have the same mobile money systems in place. So if you go into like the DR Congo, right, the DRC, you'll find that you'll find people sitting on the side of the road with stacks of different types of currencies, and people will come and pay them, and that person will send money to somebody else somewhere. It's like there's a lot more friction to how their mobile money works. Now, Kenya, we have a monopoly with one of our mobile carriers, and that's why it works so well, is because everybody's on the same network, has the same SIM cards, and so can do that. This is why it's really important to understand how balkanized Africa is in its use of technology and its economies. Not everything is the same. You can't paint it with one broad brush. You actually have to think of them as different places and have their own rules, have their own uses of technology, have their own, like the way that the society works in one country is very different than the one across the border.